The sound wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the masonry. Scrape, click, scrape. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp brick of the cellar, and I didn't hear a heartbeat. I heard the rhythmic grinding of a pendulum. I swung the sledgehammer, and the wall didn't just crumble, it bled. Behind the third layer of brick, I found her, or what was left of her. Her spinal column had been elongated and fused with the structural steel of the house, acting as a massive organic mainspring. Her ribs were no longer horizontal. They had been bent into vertical slats that vibrated every time the wind caught the chimney. She wasn't a prisoner in the wall. She had become the wall's internal mechanism. As the dust cleared, her one remaining eye flickered open, tracking the motion of the second hand I had just exposed. The aftermath of the Archon shutdown has created a phenomenon the local authorities are calling ghost structures. When the violet simulation was deleted, the gaps in our reality had to be filled by the physical world that had been suppressed for 30 decades. In downtown Chicago, entire city blocks that were once optimized parks or glass-fronted tech hubs suddenly reverted to the decaying tenements of 1996. These buildings didn't just appear, they erupted through the digital floorboards, smelling of wet plaster, lead paint, and 30 years of stagnant air. I spent the first week navigating these architectural scars, realizing that every house brought back a piece of a history the Archon group tried to burn. The Jenkins house was one of these eruptions, a 3-story brownstone that had been redacted from every digital map since the mid-90s. According to the archive, the lot was an empty, sun-drenched plaza where synchronized neighbors would gather to drink simulated coffee. But the reality was a blackened, soot-covered monolith with boarded-up windows and a front door that had been welded shut from the inside. Walking through the threshold was like stepping into a time capsule that had begun to rot from the inside out. The air was heavy with a vibrating frequency that made the hair on my arms stand up, a low-pitched mechanical groan that seemed to pulse through the floorboards like a slow, dying breath. I had been led here by the second coordinate etched into the tooth found in Thomas Miller's pocket. The carver wasn't just leaving bodies in fields, he was revealing the internal components of the world he had been building while we were asleep. As I moved through the foyer, the flickering light of my torch revealed that the wallpaper wasn't peeling due to age, but due to movement. The walls themselves were shifting, a microscopic expansion and contraction that suggested the building had a circulatory system. I realized then that the Archon group hadn't just hidden the carver. They had built the simulation on top of his workshops, using our collective hallucinations to muffle the sound of his hammers. The basement was where the frequency was loudest, a rhythmic thump hiss that sounded like an industrial furnace struggling to stay lit. I descended the rotted wooden stairs, my boots crunching on a thick layer of what I thought was sawdust, but realized was actually pulverized bone and dried lime. The walls of the cellar were a strange, dark brick that seemed to absorb the light of my flashlight, creating deep, unnatural shadows that moved independently of my movements. In the center of the room stood a single grandfather clock casing, but the glass was missing, and the pendulum inside was made of a heavy, rusted meat hook. I stood in the center of that dark cellar, the weight of the real world pressing down on me with a physical force that made it hard to breathe. I wasn't an auditor anymore. I was a trespasser in a temple of anatomy and architecture. The carver's journal spoke of governing the heart with time, and as I looked at the walls, I realized that the house wasn't just a building, it was a vessel. I took a deep breath, the iron scent of the basement filling my lungs, and I raised my sledgehammer. I knew that the second gear wasn't hidden in the house. The second gear was the house. Location 1412 West Archer Street, Chicago. The Static House. Victim Sarah Jenkins, age 27 at the time of disappearance, 1994. The forensic challenge of the Jenkins house is that the crime scene is a 3-story structural entity. We are not just looking at a body, we're looking at an integrated biotic architectural system that spans over 4,000 square feet. Every pipe in the house has been rerouted to act as a voice box, and every electrical wire has been stripped and reconnected to the victim's central nervous system. The level of biotic architectural integration is so advanced that it suggests the carver spent years, perhaps decades, refining this specific timepiece while the rest of the world was distracted by the Archon's violet sky. Sarah Jenkins disappeared in 1994, 2 years before the Great Skip began, making her one of the earliest alpha testing subjects for the carver's work. In the simulation, her file had been marked as relocated, a standard Archon euphemism for someone who had been deleted to make room for a more optimized asset. But Sarah hadn't been deleted, she had been installed. The carver had used the 30-year pause of the simulation to meticulously fuse her biology with the masonry of her own home. She was the prototype of the long-term chronometer, a biological clock designed to survive for decades without external maintenance. Dr. Aris Thorne arrived at the scene with a team of structural engineers and neurologists, all of them walking into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Thorne noted that the pulse of the house was being generated by a series of hydraulic pumps fashioned from her own cardiac tissue, reinforced with industrial-grade rubber and brass. "She's not just a clock, Silas," he said, whispering as he traced the path of a copper wire that disappeared into a crack in the ceiling. "She's a generator. The house is using her metabolic energy to power the static frequency that kept this building invisible to the Archon sensors for 30 years. The static frequency is what protected the carver's workshops from the disk cleanups I had executed as an auditor. Every time I thought I was deleting a glitch, I was actually just skimming the surface of a much deeper, more permanent infection. The Jenkins house existed in a null zone, a pocket of reality that was physically there, but digitally unrenderable. It was the perfect hiding place for a man who wanted to build a clock out of a woman. As we moved through the rooms, we found forensic markers, teeth embedded in the door frames, hair woven into the carpets, and nail fingers used as tacks for the few surviving photographs. We began the process of mapping the anatomy, which involved using thermal cameras to see where the heat was moving behind the walls. To our horror, the cameras didn't show a human shape. They showed a sprawling spiderweb network of veins and arteries that ran through the entire skeletal frame of the building. The house was warm in the same way a living body is warm, with the highest concentration of heat located in the basement's north wall. It was clear that the heart of the mechanism was located behind the masonry, and the only way to reach the second gear was to perform a structural autopsy. The sound wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the masonry. Scrape, click, scrape. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp brick of the cellar, and I didn't hear a heartbeat. I heard the rhythmic grinding of a pendulum. I swung the sledgehammer, and the wall didn't just crumble, it bled. Behind the third layer of brick, I found her, or what was left of her. Her spinal column had been elongated and fused with the structural steel of the house, acting as a massive organic mainspring. Her ribs were no longer horizontal. They had been bent into vertical slats that vibrated every time the wind caught the chimney. She wasn't a prisoner in the wall. She had become the wall's internal mechanism. As the dust cleared, her one remaining eye flickered open, tracking the motion of the second hand I had just exposed. The complexity of her integration is a testament to the carver's patience. He hadn't just put her there. He had grown her into the house, using the 30 years of the simulation to allow her body to adapt to the masonry. Every tick of her ribs sent a vibration through the entire 3-story structure, a synchronized pulse that ensured the building would stand as long as she was wound. I reached out to touch the needle on her forehead, and as I did, the ticking in the wall stopped. For 3 seconds, the entire world went silent, and then the second gear began to spin with a violent, bone-grinding speed. Dr. Thorne was the one who found the access port at the base of the wall, a small brass-rimmed hole that was perfectly sized for the winding key we had recovered from Thomas Miller. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional curiosity and moral revulsion. "Silas, the entire house is on a countdown," he whispered, pointing to a series of pressure gauges that were now visible behind the broken brickwork. "If the bone clock in her chest stops, the structural tension in the steel will be released at all once. The building won't just fall, it will explode outward." We realized that the carver had turned the Jenkins house into a dead man's switch. Sarah Jenkins was the only thing holding the 3-story brownstone together, and her energy was running low. The carver left the winding key with the first victim as a way to force me into a choice. Either let the second victim run out and destroy the neighborhood, or wind the key and become a participant in the carver's work. I held the green, oxidized brass key in my hand, the weight of it feeling like a leaden anchor. If I turned the key, I was effectively resetting Sarah's torture for another 30 years. "Look at her face," the sheriff muttered, his voice cracking as he stared at the woman in the wall. "She's not asking to be saved, Silas. She's asking for it to stop." I looked at Sarah, and for a brief second, the mechanical dial in her eye stopped spinning. She looked at me with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that no simulation could ever render. She didn't want the update or the optimization. She wanted the final shutdown. But the carver knew I wouldn't let a city block be leveled, and he knew I wouldn't let the second gear be destroyed before I understood the pattern. I inserted the key into the port at the base of the wall. The moment the brass hit the bone socket, the house let out a sound like a dying wail, a deep metallic groan that shook the foundations. I turned the key once, click. The vibration in the walls smoothed out into a steady, rhythmic hum. I turned it twice, click. Sarah's ribs began to rotate with a new terrifying vigor, and the dial in her eye reset to the XII. I had just given the static house another decade of life, and in doing so, I had officially become the carver's apprentice. Thorne looked away, unable to meet my eyes as the second gear settled into its new, optimized rhythm. We had saved the building, but we had condemned Sarah Jenkins to remain a part of the masonry for the foreseeable future. As I pulled the key out of the wall, a small slot opened in the brickwork just above Sarah's head. Out fell a small ivory tooth marked with the Roman numeral 3. The carver wasn't just rewarding me for my correct choice. He was giving me the coordinates for the next gear in the clock. The Jenkins audit has changed the nature of this investigation. We are no longer dealing with a serial killer who leaves bodies behind. We are dealing with a world builder who is using human lives to construct a permanent organic replacement for the Archon simulation. Sarah Jenkins is still in that wall, ticking away the seconds of a reality that is far more cruel than the one I deleted. I have ordered the building to be quarantined, but I know that quarantine is just a polite word for a prison. The house is a living timepiece, and we are now tasked with keeping it wound. I have spent the last 12 hours staring at the 3-tooth, trying to find the coordinate etched in the enamel. It's smaller than the last one, requiring a laser scanning microscope to fully resolve the image. The coordinate leads to a remote location in the Appalachian Mountains, a place that was once a high-security Archon data center. It seems the carver is moving away from the domestic towards the industrial, seeking a larger gear for his grand design. I can still feel the vibration of the Jenkins house in my bones, a ghost pulse that reminds me of what I've done. The Archon group was a dream of perfection, but the bone clock is a reality of sacrifice. Every second that passes in this new world is a second that was paid for with the biology of someone like Thomas Miller or Sarah Jenkins. I am no longer an auditor of the archive. I am the auditor of the carver's debt. I am the one who has to decide whose bones will be the next springs and whose teeth will be the next gears. My name is Silas Vance, and I am the man who wound the world back up. The countdown to the third gear has begun, and the frequency is changing. The ticking is getting louder, and it's no longer just coming from the walls. It's now starting to come from the ground beneath our feet. The carver's journal says that the 12th clock will strike in a place called the heart of the clockwork, and I'm starting to fear that the heart is already beating under my own floorboards. Are you still listening, or have you already become part of the mechanism?
Motherfucker, we got all right now. Every time,